Hi, Roger.
Better restart it again, Sam.
Like this is like take three, so I think
Take three.
we're in good.
I
We're
better have a drink.
Yes, everybody has been making me aren't themed cocktails. So
Yeah.
thank you for agreeing to make this audiovisual record of this moment, and to talk a little bit about Hannah Arendt and thinking. So I'm asking everyone the same question to begin, which is one of the questions that Hannah Arendt posits in The Life of the Mind, which is, where are you when you think? So where are you when you think? Where are you right now? And how is this moment affecting your ability to think?
Um, yeah, I guess I think most of all when I'm reading. Um, I find that if I want to get myself thinking about something, I will go and read something. And that's the way I write as well. I mean, most of what I've written in my life is in some way a reaction to a book. Or if I'm interested in a question, I'll go find a book that I think frames that question or reframes it and read that book and react to the question through that book.
Mm-hmm.
And so often when I'm thinking I'm in a book, uh, I will say that um, for most of my life, when I'm reading, I'm usually in a cafe.
Yeah.
I'm a cafe person. I know there are people who need quiet. There's library people. There's desk people. I'm a cafe person. I've always, I went to grad school in Berkeley. I think that had a lot to do with it. Um, but I just always go to cafes and read. And um, there's no doubt that when I can't go to a cafe like right now, it's harder for me. I have a little chair near the window here that I've been reading at,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't find that as productive as sitting in a cafe. For some reason the little bit of noise, it has to be a very particular kind of cafe. It can't be too many people talking, but there can't be pure silence. I've always have my cafes where there's always enough people talking that you drown it out, but not too many people talking.
Right.
Um, but I also like to move around. I like to go from cafe to cafe. I'll sometimes be at 2 or 3 cafes a day,
Mm-hmm.
reading, and I have a notebook and I write. And especially today, one place I know I can't be to think is on the internet. And you know, I think the weirdest thing about this plague experience is that on the one hand, unlike all the other plagues prior to this, where people could retreat to books and really be alone, um, I find that most people I know are retreating to the internet,
Mm-hmm.
and I am too, and I'm finding that really quite troublesome. So, in fact, I've set up a reading nook on this chair over there near the window that I don't ever bring my computer to,
Uh-huh.
and trying to get away from the internet. That's one of the things I like about cafes. I go to cafes. I have a few cafes I won't tell anyone about that are still in New York that don't have internet.
On a list.
Yeah, no. And I really value those cafes that don't have internet, and
Yeah.
I can go and read and think there. I think thinking is, as you well know, Hannah Arendt says, is a dialogue with yourself. But when I read, it's like a three-way dialogue. It's between me, the book, and myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so to me, I can be anywhere if I can read. Which brings up a question, and I don't know how you feel about this. I mean, I have in the last, I think it's more like 5 years, struggled to read more than I ever have in my life
Huh.
because of the internet, because of the phone, because of all the interruptions. Um, it's just harder and harder to find the time, uninterrupted time to read. I don't know if you found that at all or not.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions in there, but I think that's right. I have found that, and I've found myself developing coping mechanisms for the distraction of the internet and social media. So I have never been very good friends with sleep. 5 hours is about all I can manage a night. So I tend to be a night owl and an early riser. And the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning, is, aside from make coffee, is set a timer on my phone for an hour and read for pleasure.
Mm.
Just read with my notebook and have that quiet space in the day, to center myself before looking at Twitter, Facebook, or email. And that's helped me. I find myself setting little timers for 20 minutes or 30 minutes to read, because it's hard. It's hard to carve out space when you're juggling so many different things. So I'm wondering about this three-way dialogue between you and the book and you and yourself, and the space of the cafe versus the space of your home office that you've set up. What is it about the appearance in public, do you think, the presence of others, the sound, that alters the experience of reading and thinking for you?
I have thought about that actually, and I'm not sure I have a full answer. It's what I mean. One thing I like about cafes is there's other people there, and you sort of feel judged if you're just wasting time.
That's
Um,
true.
and so I sort of feel like it's having the super ego sitting on my shoulder, looking over me.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really not that. I, I mean, so the appearance is important. The being outside is important. I get you're right. But the cafes that I've worked best in over time are just ones where, again, it was crowded, but people were working, and there was enough noise that you could drown everything out. And I don't bring a computer.
Mm.
I think that's a big part of it. You don't have distractions. I mean, the big question now is whether I bring my phone. When I did
The
most
Apple
of my
Watch.
work, I did get an Apple Watch in order to not bring my phone. And that's sort of what I do sometimes. I'll go to a cafe, and if I get a text or something, I can look and I don't have to answer it.
Yeah.
But that's the actual reason I got an Apple Watch, was so that I could ditch the phone
Mm.
at certain places. And it's effective when I do it. I just don't do it enough. Um, is it appearing? It's a good question. There's obviously an appearance about it. I like the feeling of being in a cafe with a book, a pen, and a notebook,
Hmm.
and that that sense, in a sense, inspires me to read. Um, and when I'm at a cafe, I'm there. I can't get up and go to the cabinet or get this or that.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that the public is important. Not so much in that I'm appearing. I mean, I'm not putting on a performance, but I think it helps focus me, and it helps. I think I feel like I'm someone reading in a cafe, and that's obviously something that means something to me, I guess.
Well, it's when you're talking about it, I hear almost a physicality, an embodiment in the activity of reading itself, the experience of holding a book, of using a pen, of paper, of not having the digital distraction, of having the energetic exchange happening physically between you and the space that you're occupying, in a way that might enliven thinking in a specific way that we might not otherwise have access to. But it strikes me almost as, in my image of Arendt lying on her couch with a cigarette, thank you, Barbara Suckowa,
Yeah, that's from a movie. That's not from
I
reality.
know,
That's
I know, but I think a lot of people have that image in their head because of that, of Arendt as somebody who performed thinking, who they could see thinking when she spoke, and the way that she talks about thinking is something that happens in a space of solitude. And so for her, that space of solitude in part rests upon the necessity of the private realm and the ability to retreat from public space. but
But
you're
I think, just to say, I think a
yeah,
cafe is a very private space.
yeah.
I mean, I guess that's what I was trying to say with when with the cafe. I mean, when I'm in a cafe, there may be other people around, but I feel in my own world. I mean, it is a feeling where, and I feel like I can get lost. Now, I will say one of the things I do like about a cafe is that every once in a while, someone will come and interrupt you. Um, and sometimes they're a good friend, and that's a really great experience to just be interrupted by a good friend. I really love that. And
Yeah,
then sometimes it's just some nosy person saying, "Oh, you're reading Nietzsche or you're reading Hannah Arendt. I studied them in college," or something like that. And I
yeah.
just want to shoot the person. But um, because you know, they all think, "Oh, I want to talk about Hannah Arendt or whatever." And
Yeah,
um, so, but I do like the fact that there's this chance element of it.
yeah,
But 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 really, I actually do feel more in solitude in a cafe than I do in my desk at home. Um, and maybe it's because I sort of have to put up a barrier,
mhm,
and as a result, I really am alone with myself and the book in a cafe.
mhm.
Um, I don't know, maybe that doesn't make sense, but I actually have a more, you asked the question, where am I when I think, and I can I have I have so many distinct memories
Mm,
of different cafes
mm,
where I had particular ideas.
mhm.
I can tell you where I had ideas about ressentiment and revenge that were very important to me for a long time. It was at Cafe Rouse in Amherst. And
I know that cafe.
yeah, and there are certain cafes where I have had certain ideas
Yeah,
and with certain books in front of me. And I feel much more like that's where I'm alive intellectually and mentally thinking than in this messy room.
certificate.
And my room is always messy. There's just nothing I can do about it. That's something else I really appreciate about a cafe. You bring one book, one notebook, and you put them on the table, and there's nothing else, and you feel like clean and you feel
Yeah,
ordered,
you feel
which I
ordered.
never feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never feel that at home.
You're not constantly, there might be other distractions that can possibly interrupt you, but you're not constantly being distracted by your home life and all the other things that you could be
Yeah,
attending to in your space. It resonates deeply with me. When I was in graduate school, taking my comprehensive exams, I actually prepared for them in a cafe in Washington, D.C. And then I flew back to Amherst to take the exam, which was a 1 week take home written and then an oral. And when I sat down to start to write it in Amherst, I realized, because I had prepared for it in this cafe in DC, that there was no way I was going to be able to write it in Amherst. So I got on a plane that night. I flew back to DC and wrote it in my cafe and then flew back to defend.
that's amazing. That's a great story. Yeah, no,
I, it's
um,
insane in a certain way, but I think we have those spatial memories.
yeah, no, I mean my first book, that I wrote, The Gift of Science. While I largely wrote much of it in Berkeley, I rewrote it and finished it in 3 years at a cafe in New York, Cafe Doma, which no longer exists. I mean, they changed it; it's still there somewhere, but it's
Yeah.
not what it was. And I mean, I remember when the book first came out, and I went in and I gave them a copy of it and said, "Look, this book was written here." I mean, it's those are great memories, and so I think one of the things that's really frustrating to me about this moment is by being stuck at home. Um, it's not, I actually don't feel so cut off from people because I've been having more phone conversations and more internet conversations than I probably ever had in months, or years, decades. I mean,
Yeah.
I've actually had a great week and a half or 2 weeks of talking to friends and catching up and doing things. Um, but less time. I mean, I've been making time, trying to make time, but feeling a little bit not feeling a bit like I need to get out of the house,
Yeah.
and that's not going to happen here in New York City for a little while. So
No, no. So as we're talking and I'm thinking about space and I'm thinking about writing and conversation and the work that you do and the work that we do at the Hannah Arendt Center. I'm thinking about how much of the work we do relies upon the creation of space and creating space for conversations. Conversations ideally in person with students on campus, at the Hannah Arendt Center, at the house, at the Mary McCarthy House, in dorm rooms, or in lecture halls, and creating spaces where people can physically come together and think about oftentimes things that aren't easy to think about. And I'm just wondering if you could talk, maybe for people who aren't super familiar with the Hannah Arendt Center, about how that conception of running a Hannah Arendt Center came into existence, and how you've thought about that work of creating space for conversation over the years, and how you're thinking about it now in this moment of pandemic and Corona time.
no, yeah, thank you. You know, I we have a mission statement that I can never remember. Um, but I do
Bold
remember,
provocative thinking.
yeah, but you forgot the part that comes before it. At least I assume it's still in it because it was when I started it. To nurture a space
Yes.
for that, a space that nurtures the bold and provocative thinking in the spirit of Hannah Arendt. That was very much how I figured it. And you know, I mean, I guess looking back on it now, you could have thought, oh, he's an Arendtian, so he's talking about space. I wasn't thinking that way. Garrett's giving me way too much credit.
I've never
Um,
actually heard it that way. You said that just now. It seems totally common sense to think about it that way, but I've never heard it that way.
and it's never how I meant it. I meant it simply as literally a space to come together and talk. Which and you know, I've spent many years in different contexts. I mean, when I was an undergrad, I started a magazine called Prism, with the idea was that you'd have one topic and everyone would write on that topic from different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And in high school, I started a club in which we would have a week long, 3 week long series a year. We'd bring in speakers on one topic from different perspectives. So I guess, I mean, if you want to look back and say I'm incredibly boring, but I've had a consistency to my ideas, which is that I've for a long time believed in the importance of bringing people who disagree together and who think together. And there's many things about Hannah Arendt that I love, a few that I maybe don't. Um,
We're
but
going to come back to that.
nah, well, we'll see. Um, I have to have another drink. Um, but but there's probably nothing I love about her more than her fearlessness. And this idea that she has that, I quote a lot. I think some people quote a lot, but I think most people just, if they actually were put to it, don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that there is no truth in politics,
Right.
and that it's really all opinion, and that the whole premise of objectivity is something that's foreign to political and social life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I was rereading her, I forget what it's called, moral considerations essay, the lecture courses today.
Yes.
And she's like, and I'm going to say something which I think you're all going to disagree with, which is that all of our opinions are subjective. There are no objective truths. And I
Yeah.
was like, man, that is just so right about her. And she's absolutely right that 99% of even the people who think they agree with it don't agree with it.
Yep.
They believe in expert opinions. They believe, and we've seen this with this whole coronavirus mishigas, where, you know, you see people saying we have to listen to the experts, and then you have someone like Trump saying, well, we can't let the experts run everything. And, I, and if you say anything like, well, actually, Arendt sort of agrees with him on that, you're going to get nailed and say, oh, you're just trolling for Trump. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
But I mean, Trump is wrong, but he's wrong not because he doesn't listen to experts. um
Yeah.
and so, you know
Well, she draws that distinction, I think, between experts and the human condition, or that's what you're talking about, thinking in moral consideration, when she's talking about professional thinkers. And for her, that doesn't mean that there isn't scientific fact or mathematical fact or historical facts. And yeah,
yeah, I know she definitely, her problem is not with experts. It's with experts who think that their expertise makes them better judges of things,
right.
right? So I have no problem with an expert who tells me, here's a model that shows that 100,000 to 200,000 people will die if
Right.
we don't do this. Now, there's a couple things I should say. One is there are other experts who think that that model's wrong, and that it's going to be lower or higher.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but none of that tells me what I should do. And when an expert says, because of that, here's what we should do. We should shelter in place. We should do this. As far as I'm concerned, he's no longer an expert, or she's no longer an expert. I mean,
Yeah.
now she may be an expert in saying, if we do this, this will happen. If we do that, that'll happen. But at that point, it gets a lot more complicated, and I think the experts know a lot less. But we can try. In any case, the RN Center, it's a weird way back to the question, is an attempt to um, create a space where people who are experts and people who are not, where students and faculty, where we have a lot of members who are, just lay people. And I don't mean just lay people, I mean, but lay people. We have writers, we have artists. One of the things we've always done is brought writers and artists and poets. You've helped bring a lot of poets in. Um, and part of the premise of the center, which I think is very Arendtian,
Mm-hmm.
um, although I think when I started it, I didn't know it was so Arendtian, um, is that the pursuit of thinking about the world has to include not only people who disagree politically, but people from very different backgrounds,
Right.
from literature, from philosophy, from business. I mean, at most of our conferences, we have business people speaking. At most of our conferences, we have artists speaking, and we have some academics. But I get a lot of critique from other academics saying there's not enough academics at your conferences, and I'm like, well, actually, there's usually a fair bit, but they're from different programs, they're from different fields, from different backgrounds. But they're not only academics, and I think most academics are only used to talking to other academics.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I like about what we've done is to bring in a wider range of perspectives and people.
Yeah. I feel like I feel like I have two things. One of the things that I feel like you have helped me become much more attuned to in speaking is learning how to talk to people who aren't academics about academic ideas, which is something that I've always been really committed to politically since I was in college and doing kind of public work. But when you're immersed in an academic institution environment, you really get used to just having conversations that are really laden with jargon. And I think even with Hannah Arendt's work, sometimes it's easy to fall into those kinds of conversations about thinking or judgment that aren't as accessible to people,
Yeah.
which is not the kind of work she was dedicated to.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this has been a theme of mine for my whole life. First of all, when I decided to go to graduate school, I remember vividly, I called my mother up and I said, I'm, going to apply for some of these PhD programs.
Yeah.
And she went crazy. She was like, no. And I was like, why not? And she's like, because you're going to become one of those people no one understands. And,
That's
and,
wonderful.
and so she made a deal with me that every paper I wrote in grad school, I had to send to my mother.
Yeah.
And if she couldn't understand it, I had to rewrite it. and it was one of those crazy things. Of course, I didn't do every paper, but I did it a lot, and it really forced me to write and speak in a way that was comprehensible. And I was not very good at it at the beginning, because I think very few people at the beginning can be, because you get caught up in jargon, you get excited about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I did go to an interdisciplinary program, and that had the advantage of the fact that the faculty were all from different disciplines, and so you couldn't get caught up in just one jargon. Um, and then I had a particular professor, Philippe Nonet, who just, he taught law. I did a PhD in law, and he insisted that in our classes we not be allowed to use any legal terms. So
Hmm.
if you wanted to say, the defendant, you had to actually say the person who is being, accused or charged. You had to put it in a sentence. And
Right.
it was a great, and it was amazing how hard it was to do, and the result was that you actually force yourself to speak English rather than legalese or jargon. And I still do that when I teach with my students. Like, for just to give an example, when I teach Hannah Arendt, I refuse to let students use the word natality.
Right.
You know this. This is a bugaboo of mine. I found when I first started reading Hannah Arendt, it was natality this and natality that,
Oh, yeah.
and I just lost it. I thought this was the stupidest stuff in the world. I mean, natality is a
The
word
mentality craze in the early aughts among the
yeah.
parents
I mean,
called.
she probably, I never done the work, but I imagine she uses the word natality in her writing 15 to 20 times. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a slightly more, but it's not that much. And it just became this thing where everyone was writing about natality, and so I have made a real effort to almost never use the word natality in anything I've ever written about Hannah Arendt. And that's just, these are little things, but they're things that I take very seriously. And as you know, we have a lot of student programs at the Hannah Arendt Center, and I want students to feel empowered to speak. And
Mhm.
I think there's two ways you can empower people to speak these days. One is teach them a jargon and let them feel special and elite. And the other is to just let them speak in everyday language and make them speak clearly. And
Yeah.
I certainly prefer the latter.
Yeah, and it strikes me also, I feel like reading Hannah Arendt's work teaches that kind of thinking, which makes you engage with the language you're using when you talk about something. I mean, obviously, this is part of her critique of Eichmann and the use of jargon and cliches and stock phrases. But I feel like we're living in a political moment right now where it's very easy to rely upon certain words to do a lot of heavy lifting and conversation for us that prevent us from actually explaining what it is that we're thinking, feeling, experiencing ourselves, holding up that particular um, to experience. I'm wondering about this and the critique of experts. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you that's been coming up in thinking with Hannah Arendt about this moment is her critique of professional philosophers. So she talks about how the language of uh, professional thinkers, Kant's and philosophers turns us away from what's happening in front of us. And in a lot of my personal conversations with people for the past few weeks, I've been really surprised by how many people are unwilling to kind of see what's happening right now. Like there's a general resistance to change behavior, to take personal responsibility for the collective good. And I was wondering if you were, if that's something you've experienced or if you've been thinking about that or what it is about our particular moment right now that's preventing people from seeing the severity of this pandemic.
Well, I think, I mean, you and I haven't talked so much recently about what I've been doing, but what I've been writing about for the last 5 months is her thinking about experts. The speech I gave in Bremen for the Hannah Arendt Prize was about that, and so this is really what I think right now is the number one issue in our world. Um, there's and it's on many levels. So, as you know, because I've written about it, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben,
Yes.
uh, you know, in late February, wrote a piece, an essay in which he said, this is just the flu, and it's being used by governments to justify disciplinary and authoritarian, um, actions, and we should reject this and things of that sort. Um, you know, he was clearly wrong, and I think what I said in the first thing I wrote about it, because I've written a couple things on it, is he was wrong because he has a theory.
Mm-hmm.
He has a theory about um, their life and the way things are reduced to life, and that we shouldn't only care about life, we should also care about the meaning of the world, which, by the way, Arendt agrees with him on and I agree with him on. But he basically took his theory and said that out of biopolitics, the governments are going to use things like the flu to take more control, and applied it without ever looking at the facts and without ever looking at what was actually going on.
Yeah.
And this is the danger of all professional thinkers. Um, in a sense, the definition of a professional thinker and an expert, for Arendt, both, and though they're different, but what they both share is a fear of an unwillingness to see reality.
Right.
Um, you know, she thinks that experts get caught up in their ability to control things, um, and they have an idea of, we can win this war or we can do this, and whenever facts don't fit, they reinterpret the facts. She thought Marxists did the same thing, right? We have a theory of alienation, we have a theory of surplus labor, and no matter what happens, it always works because we can massage the facts to fit the theory.
Right.
And so her view, and she says the same thing in Eichmann about the people who read her book wrong. She says they were intellectuals. The intellectuals were the most dangerous readers of her book because they all read her book looking to prove their theory.
Mm.
Um, and so, one of the things that's really deep in Arendt is, just like she's also very skeptical of objectivity, she's very skeptical of anyone who is too who is theoretical. This is one of the reasons, I don't like calling her a political theorist. I mean, even though she once said I'm a political theorist, I don't think she was. I think she was a political thinker. And
The phrase I always use as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I do too. And she's very much worried about um, experts getting caught up in their view of the world and not seeing reality. And so I'll just say that we see this now as, I think, the most important issue of our time. The reason Donald Trump is president
Mm-hmm.
is not economic. It's because an intellectual elite, largely college educated, primarily college educated, on the left and center, and even partly on the right, for the last 60 years, has basically taken power in the Western world. I mean, that can maybe a little longer than that, but in a certain part of the world, and imposed its view of the world, and they think it's the only view. Now, I happen to share that view. I'm one of them,
You
and
say
I'm
a
largely
little bit about what the view is.
you know, we can we can talk about it in a lot of different ways, but there's I think certain elements of it. One is cosmopolitan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm someone who travels around the world giving lectures, and now runs a global humanities center, through the Open Society University Network, which is starting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a very cosmopolitan person. I've studied and lived in 4 or 5 different countries, and I share that love of internationalism. and to some degree a skepticism of parochialism and nationalism. Um, and yet that's not that's one view, and it's not the view of most people in the world.
Right.
And yet it's become the dominant view of even people on the right who are in leadership around the world. I mean, not the far right that's happened as a rebellion against that, but before 5 or 10 years ago, left and right shared that view. Um, another place we can see that is religion.
Hmm.
I think there's a general skepticism amongst what you call us elites, um, about religion. Um, uh, General skepticism about, um, or general, a clear priority for what multiculturalism or diversity.
Hmm.
Um, um, and I guess another way to put it, another aspect of it would be a belief that the problems of the world can largely be solved. Uh, Progressivism. I mean, even conservative intellectuals generally have embraced the idea that government can solve our problems. If there's a problem, we can solve it.
Right.
And so, um, I'm sure there's other aspects to it of it as well, but I think these are some core fundamental values of my class, your class. If I speak for you and I, of elites, and this basic idea that the government can solve the problems and make things better. um, I don't think is shared by a majority of people in the world. And they look at the schools, and the schools don't seem to get better, and they look at healthcare and it doesn't seem to get better, and they look at immigration and they see people taking, in their view, taking their jobs, and they look at a loss of feeling American, and they say, well, why shouldn't we feel American or English or whatever it is, or Russian or Indian or Israeli. And so I think there is a prejudice that experts have that their view is objective in some way and therefore better.
Right.
and and, um, and I think that's an incredibly dangerous prejudice, and it prevents them from seeing other views, other ways of seeing the world. And um and and I think that we are now witnessing a rebellion against experts and elites around the world. I think that's, in my mind, that's the sort of ground trait of what unites all the different rising populist leaders around the world, is a distrust and a disdain for experts who have distrusted and disdained the rest of the people for the last 50 or 60 years. And I think that what I think is so interesting about this moment around the coronavirus is you're seeing, like, the populist in chief having to negotiate dealing with experts
Right.
on a podium every day for 2 hours. And you see him, on the one hand, struggling against them and trying to say, I'm not going to listen to the experts and they're just experts. On the other hand, clearly realizing that in some cases the experts know something and he's got to listen to them.
One of the things that I've been really struck by watching these briefings, which I'm honestly quite torn about watching, but in a certain way feel a civic responsibility to watch, is the extent to which he is um, censoring reporters who are asking questions and who are reading his own statements back to him. And there seems to be in his engagement habits and in Trump's speech habits this desire for simplifying the narrative, right? And I think the desire for the overly simplified narrative is part of the disdain for expertise. Have you tied those two together? I know it's something Arendt talks about in Origins.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, as you and I know this well, we've talked a lot about it. Um, the premise of ideological thinking is not that the lies are going to convince anybody.
Right.
It's that they express a kind of solidarity. So when Trump says something like, you know, this is a hoax,
Yeah.
in his view, he's not saying the coronavirus is a hoax. Maybe he meant it then. I don't know. I mean, but what he's saying is, look, don't trust these Democrats. They're out to get me.
Right.
And his people understand that. And now the problem is that in a situation like we're in now, even though most of his people understand that, some don't. And some actually take him seriously and then start having coronavirus parties and saying,
Yeah.
see, it's all a hoax. Therefore, we can just go and have a party or go to the beach in Fort Lauderdale and
Yeah.
lather suntan lotion on each other's backs. And aren't we cool? And so, while I do I've had a hard time dealing with this because on the one hand, I'm, as I said, I'm a cosmopolitan elite. I am as appalled by Trump's lies as everybody else, and yet, in our world, in our class, and yet I'm also very much aware that for him and many of his followers, he's seen as a truth teller, and that those two things aren't necessarily at odds.
Yeah.
He's telling a truth against our worldview. And a lot of us, by the way, make factual mistakes all the time in what we say. We just don't call each other on it because we largely agree with each other.
Yeah.
What we're seeing right now is someone get up and make a lot of factual mistakes, someone who doesn't really care and speak very carefully. I don't know if he's actually dyslexic or not, but I don't think he reads. I don't think he's someone who, has a very good grasp on minutia at all.
Yeah.
Or reality, but he's telling a particular truth, and a lot of people find the truth he's telling a meaningful counterweight to the truth that people like me and journalists and you and others have been telling for many years. So I get that, and I think that one of the reasons this particular crisis is hard for him is that he actually has to listen to the experts.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that he has. I mean, he's almost, at least in the last 3 weeks, he's almost never gone against what the experts have told him. He said things against what the experts have told him, but
He's
he
yes. I mean,
but he hasn't gone against it.
but he also could be doing more. And
Yes, I was going to say he hasn't shown leadership. I
no.
mean, there's a difference between Andrew Cuomo and Donald
Yeah.
Trump. I mean, Andrew Cuomo gets up there and tells you what's going on,
Yes.
and you feel led, and you feel
Yes.
confident. And yet, I mean, you know,
One of
what's amazing to me is that 60% of the country thinks that Trump is doing a good job
yes.
on this. And what that tells me is that 60% of the country listen to Trump and feel confident and led. And that's, the easy answer is, oh my God, I tremble when I think that these are my countrymen.
But is there a difference between feeling led and feeling represented? Feeling like finally there's a voice in the public sphere, which is, creating that sense of solidarity for those who felt betrayed by the political leaders of the past, who didn't like Obama, who didn't like Clinton. Um, is there a difference? I mean, because a part of that, part of what I'm wondering and thinking about all these people throwing house parties and going on spring break, and we're going to, what is it, the woman on Twitter who said, like, this is America and I'll do what I want, so I'm going to eat a burger in a restaurant. Is that there seems to be a remarkably anti-statist attitude. They don't want to be led. They have a conception of what it means to be an American citizen. They have a conception of freedom, and they're looking for that. I'm trying not to use the language of like negative liberty, but they're looking for that, you know, that sense of America.
Self-reliance, to quote Emerson, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I don't want to do that to Emerson, but I mean, it is
no, but
it's
there is an
essentially.
element of Emersonian self-reliance. I mean, what was that book that a couple years ago was so good and everyone read? I read and thought very highly of.
The
But the
Harley Hochschild book, Strangers
Yeah,
in.
the Hochschild book, "Strangers in Their Own Land." I was gonna say the Berkeley anthropologist who went down to talk to people in Louisiana,
Yeah,
and um, and I mean, there's a lot in that book, and I thought it was an excellent book. But one of the things that really struck me was how so many of these people were like, "Look, I'd rather die and get sick than have people come in and tell me how to live my life."
yeah,
And there was just a lot of that in that book, and I think that that's something people need to take seriously. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned before was Giorgio Agamben
yeah.
suggesting that it's a mistake to treat this virus as this disaster, because the virus is attacking us as living beings in our animality, in our what he calls bare life,
Yeah.
um, and that's not the worst thing in the world, and that and so I've put an Arendtian twist on this, which is that, as you well know, in much of her work, including the Human Condition, I mean, her main worry is what she calls the rise of anima laborans, turning man into a laboring animal. And
Part of her
for
critique of
those who
art.
don't know,
Yes.
yeah, for those who don't know, the key of that is that we can more and more of our human faculties are directed towards keeping us alive and reproducing and keeping the human race healthy and living, rather than other activities which are more spiritual, or more worldly. You know, so for example, one of the things we're doing right now is not letting um, partners into hospitals uh, for deliveries. So I think Cuomo changed that yesterday, which but if parents are sick or people are sick, people aren't allowed to go visit them. Funerals are being in Italy not allowed, or at least I don't know if they're fully not allowed or just very few people. And you know, obviously I understand the public health experts who are making these rules,
Yeah.
but there is a loss of what does it mean to be a human person, to have dignity, to be remembered, and to die without a funeral is very much like to die an animal, to die alone. Um,
Well, one is reminded
and
of Antigone.
one is reminded of Antigone, many things.
Mm.
And so, one of the things that Arendt, I think, forces us to ask is, um, are we, to some degree, um, in our, as Cuomo would say, the number one goal is to preserve as many lives as we can,
Yeah.
right? Is that correct? Now, the problem I think with Trump is that the opposing value he sets to that is not is profit, is the economy. And
Yeah.
that's not where I would set the opposing value. But I understand it. I think there are opposing values to life. Their dignity, their love and friendship, their community. There's having built a life. Uh, you know, you. I've been going and talking to a lot of people who own small businesses.
Yeah.
They've spent 20, 5, 10, 20, sometimes 30 years building a business,
Yeah.
and they're very worried that their whole life's work may end. This
Yeah.
isn't about profit. It's not about profit. It's about dignity, and it's about part of what a human life is. And
It's
one of the things that I think the experts miss is that if you don't mind, I'm gonna cite someone that people don't like to cite anymore, named Friedrich Hayek. I've been reading
really
a lot
love
of
Hayek.
Hayek.
I mean, I
Okay,
disagree with everything, but I love him because he's brilliant.
I've I've been reading a lot of Hayek this month because it turns out the only two 20th century intellectuals that I can find that in their work argue that intellectuals and experts are the real problem are Arendt and Hayek.
Uh-huh.
And so I've been trying to write about Arendt and Hayek on this question. And one of the things that Hayek writes about that I find incredibly smart is what he calls the prejudice of scientism, or the prejudice of experts.
Mm.
And what he says is every expert thinks they know how to solve a problem. So, for example, the coronavirus experts think they know how to solve that problem. The housing experts think they know how to give everybody a house.
Right.
The med care, Bernie's medical care people think they know how to give everyone medical care.
The
Um,
bureaucratization of expertise.
okay, but that's not my point per se, although it's related. What
Yeah.
it is everyone, the housing experts say we can do housing, we can fix that. The healthcare experts say we can do that. The problem is they're right. If if we were to give them control of the whole economy, the coronavirus experts could get rid of the coronavirus. But what would they destroy? The healthcare experts could give everyone a house. I mean, get everyone, good healthcare. But what would they destroy?
Yeah.
And the problem is, what he says is that experts, because they rightfully believe that they can actually solve the problems that they have set for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that anytime we don't solve those problems, we're not being objective, and we're not being good scientists, and we're not being experts. What they don't understand is that there are other problems, and that solving these problems would lead to other problems. And so that's what he calls the bias of experts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a bias that we're deeply, deeply suffering from right now.
Yeah. I think, I'm not sure I think about it quite the same way that you do. I want to kind of bring it to an example, actually a personal example, that I've been thinking about this week. So my family, actually. So um, my mother's parents were German immigrants who grew up in a ghetto in Cincinnati, and my father's parents fled after the potato famine, and he grew up on a chicken farm in Michigan. And, both of my parents, most of my life, had very working middle class jobs. My dad was a manager for the UFCW at a Kroger, and my mom was a waitress. And when I was about 18, my mom, after about 20 years of waitressing, bought a small business. She bought a small store. And in 2008, 2009, when the economy collapsed, she couldn't maintain it. And she was forced to sell it to a family of immigrants from Iran who promised her that she could continue to manage and run it. And that lasted for about a year until a relative showed up, and they gave her job managing the store to him. So as a result, being a woman in her mid-late 50s, having to find work without any kind of formal education, she found a job cleaning at the local hospital, which is where she's been working for about the past 10 years now. About a month ago, she had a bout of pancreatitis, and so she has been off of work and is supposed to go back next week. And she is deciding whether or not to go back to work. Because if she goes back to work, there's pretty much 100% chance that she'll get coronavirus and get very sick because she has pre-existing conditions. And what's complicating my mother's decision to do this is the fact that if she doesn't go back to work, she's going to have to buy private health insurance, which she can't afford to do. So, I am, so the first thought that I have is, you know what, let the health insurance experts make sure everyone has health insurance. Because if everybody has some form of good health insurance, which guarantees they can go to the doctor and not be financially crippled, then people like my mother, who almost achieved the American dream, as we call it, and was thwarted by political and economic powers, outside of her control, wouldn't have to make a decision about going back to work right now in this way. You know, and I think part of, you know, to put on my, and, you know, to put on the what's the word, the devil's hat. It's not a devil's hat.
Devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Devil's advocate.
Yeah, to play devil's advocate. You know, I think that some of the people who are critical of the liberal elite, who are critical of the experts who think that they can solve problems, understand those experts to be the very people that are manufacturing the problems that need to be solved, instead of trying to develop policy that is human oriented. And, you know, so I'm, you know, on the one hand, I'm really sympathetic to your, you know, to your approach and to your understanding of thinking about why populism is surging around the globe right now. And I think that it's absolutely right to think about this kind of anti-expertise, anti-professional thinker class. But at the same time, it doesn't quite capture the whole picture for me. Because I think it speaks to a certain population of people who have an idea of what America is. And I don't think it speaks for all of them, though. I think there's also, you know, I'm not sure what it is, perhaps a more democratic desire to counter the liberal elite.
Well, I mean, part of the issue is that I would put Bernie supporters in the same populist camp. I mean,
Well,
obviously,
you and a lot of people.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that the fact that, you know, if the numbers are correct, Bernie has somewhere around 30 to 35% of the Democratic Party, which I think is about 15% of the American electorate.
Yep.
I could be wrong, but I think that's the numbers. Trump, let's say, has something like 90% of the Republican Party, or what's left of it, which is about 40% of the American electorate.
Yeah.
So Trump and Bernie together, if this works, and again, I'm not a statistician, so I'll bracket that out, have something along the lines of 55% of the American people who are what we would basically call anti-establishment or anti the system.
Yes.
I think that one of the problems that the liberal elite has, which whether we like it or not, we are part of the system, right now, is that we are not taking seriously the anger and disenfranchisement of that 55% of people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that until we do, and until in some way the system changes to bring those people in, I think we're going to be in this kind of violently swinging populist mode for a while. I have no idea when it changes, because I don't think it changes when either Trump gets elected or when Bernie gets elected, because I don't think either of them have the capacity to create a new center. You know, I think what's lacking right now is a candidate who can bring together some sort of the center, whatever that is anymore, with enough of the people who support Trump and enough of the people who support Bernie to rethink and remodel the system, if you will. And that's going to take someone who has a certain kind of earnest and rhetorical ability. And there was no one who really did that. I mean, I think the person who came closest to it in the election, in the Democratic primary at least, was Pete Buttigieg, who tried as a millennial, you know, whatever. I don't think he obviously didn't succeed, and I don't think he was ready for it. But you know, the point is, it's unclear to me who might do that, and I don't know if it will be done in our lifetimes. I mean, this could last. This kind of seesawing populism could last a generation or two. I mean, there's no reason to think it won't.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I told you before we started this conversation that on violence to me is the most relevant of Arendt's essays right now, and the reason we're going to start reading it this week in our reading group is because the whole premise of On Violence is that the rise of violence in the 60s and the glorification of violence came about because of a broadening sense amongst the population, especially the young population, that the system was corrupt and the system was not listening to them, and that frustrated in their inability to be heard, they turned to violence. She thinks that was a mistake, although she thinks sometimes violence can work. She thinks it didn't in that case, and that she says in most cases what violence will lead to is not a reform of the system or a revolution, but simply more violence.
Yes.
And I think in many ways that swing started in the 60s, and we've seen it go to the Reagan revolution in the 80s, back and forth, and now we're back in Trump land. I think a lot of the analysis that Arendt does about violence and partiality and the fight between the elite and the people who are outside of the elite that she does in that essay on violence is very much at the heart of what's going on now in politics. And so it's one of the reasons I think it's a deeply relevant essay to read and talk about today.
And it's not a coincidence that that time period, 1968, 69, the student protest movements, and then the Nixon administration and the Pentagon Papers, all of this coincides with the loss of trust and authority in government as well, I think, which brings
Absolutely
to experts. So maybe we can move towards wrapping up. One of the things that I've been thinking about as you were talking about the possibility of a center and the need for some form of political unification is this conversation that I think a lot of people are having around solidarity. Do you think that this global event, which is a new experience for all of us, is creating a space for the possibility for a new form of political solidarity?
I think there's two different ways I could imagine answering a question like that, which is a great question. One is personal and one is political. And they can be related, but I do think that the challenge to the system that this virus is offering, and the forced solitude, loneliness, isolation, we can pick which word we want to use, that it is forcing upon many people, could in certain circumstances lead to people thinking in the way we started this conversation, encountering themselves and asking themselves the kinds of hard questions about what we believe, what's brought us to this state, why the system has failed, and maybe off creating new thoughts and new ideas that could be articulated, whether it's in books or podcasts or actions or artworks, and begin the process of making worldly new ideas. So that would be the hopeful idea that with a lot of people, I hope a lot of smart people, having a lot of time to think and spend by themselves, maybe they'll start to ask themselves, why is it that 60% of the people like Trump? Or the Trump supporters will say, well, maybe we should listen to the experts a little more. And maybe some people will start, breaking down some of their barriers and confront reality. I mean, Arendt always says that, you know, in a revolutionary situation when power and authority have basically been destroyed, power is lying in the streets waiting for it to be picked up.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think on and off for the last 60 years, power's been lying in the streets since the 60s, waiting to be picked up.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been picked up largely because those who would try to pick it up, the so-called revolutionaries, as she called them in the 60s, and I would still call them that today, um, are not actually addressing the world. They're addressing theories. They're still thinking in theories, neo-Marxism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
People have to get over that stuff. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to make a lot of enemies here, but we got to get over that stuff.
She doesn't want to get over it. I mean,
Of course she does.
Arendt thinks with Marx, but she argues against him. I mean, it's not throwing it away. It's engaging.
I'm not saying throwing it away. I'm saying that you have to look at the world, and for whatever reasons, good or bad, and the Marxist approach has not worked. Right? It has, whenever it's been tried, it hasn't worked. And people will say, oh, well, that hasn't tried well, or you got to try it better, or you got to do this. It hasn't worked. It's led to disaster in the places that it's been tried.
It certainly led to a lot of catastrophes in certain places. What I call
catastrophe or disaster, either one. Sure. I'll go with either one. Yeah. The point is, it's not going to, it's not going to be the answer. It's not going to be the idea that inspires a new solidarity. It's too politicized. It's too wrong.
Yes.
I think, and so to keep, trotting it out there as now is a new time for Marxism, as, Jacobin and others are trying to do, again, I think is just asking to be irrelevant. And so if there's going to be a new solidarity, it's going to come from a new idea. It's going to come from new thoughts and new actions that speak to concerns like you raised with your mother about needing, healthcare, and obviously the need for healthcare is one of the ideas that has been deeply meaningful to people. And yet thinking about how to do it in a way that's not technocratic Obamacare bureaucraties, but not maybe pure public option either, or whatever. The point is, I don't know the answers.
Yeah.
But if they're going to come, it's going to come from new ideas that inspire us, not trying to retread old ideas.
I think that's right. And it reminds me of one of my favorite Walter Benjamin essays on left-wing melancholia, where he talks about worn out in a very, Arendtian spirit, although Arendt was reading Benjamin, the idea that we can't reuse old political slogans and ideas to address contemporary political problems, that we need new language, we need new concepts and ideas. But I think one of, just to throw in a little, one of the things that I think people who are, clinging to the language of socialism right now, perhaps have a staked belief in it and are ideologically committed to an idea of socialism. But I think also, in my years on the left, in my youth in college, one of the, which I realized today it's going to be, I'm about to hit the 20-year mark, which is a little crazy, is that sometimes you push that hard from a radical position, just to push the conversation. It's not because you believe that, overnight with the election of a candidate who calls himself socialist, we're going to have universal health care, but it's that this, pushing the conversation so hard from a radical perspective can actually tilt the conversation in a progressive way. And I think, that is something that we have been witnessing in the United States with Bernie's campaign, or people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, agree with them, disagree with them. They have pushed the conversation. And I think sometimes that's, what people are trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's called power politics, which I'm perfectly happy to talk about. And all I'd say is
I have
they've
no idea what
lost,
power politics is.
but I think they've lost. I mean, the very fact that maybe you disagreed with the numbers I gave before, but 40% of the people who don't like the system vote for Trump, and 15% of it vote for Bernie. Yes, they've changed the conversation on the left, but they haven't changed, I think, the conversation. In fact, if anything,
Well, but
look at
we've even seen Biden during this election campaign, after his last slate of wins, move a little bit more to a progressive, left position on certain issues, like I believe student loans, closer to Elizabeth Warren's position when she was still in the campaign. So it can have an effect on candidates who are seen to be the institutional candidates as well, and modifying positions to appeal to those people.
Yeah, but I don't think a lot of those positions are that far out of the institutional. I mean, I'll actually put it this way. I don't think any one of Bernie's positions are that far out of the institutional center of the Democratic Party. I think it's the totality of them that is outside of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I mean, even Medicare for all, I don't think is that far out of. I mean, I think it's not a majority, but it's not that far out of it. There's a lot of people who support it.
Yeah.
But none of the positions, I think, are non-starters. And I think if a candidate were to pick one or two or three of them and say, these are the three we're going to push for, I think they'd be very popular in the center of the Democratic Party. And I think that's what Biden's going to end up doing. I mean, whether he can do it with the power and eloquence we need is a different story. But I hope so, because I think it's an important election. Just to go on the other aspect of solidarity that I was going to mention.
Yes.
It's something that Arendt talks about only a few times in her writing, but she does use the word solidarity in certain ways, and what she says is there are really two ways to bring people together today. One is through pity. And so you tell the rich, and you tell the center, and you tell the establishment that they should have pity for the poor and try and help them. And she thinks this is that there's two problems with this. One is that it's arrogant and it's dismissive of the poor. It actually doesn't listen to the poor so much as it tries to be paternalistic and tell them what they should want. And it's the approach of most liberals or socialists in her mind.
You're thinking on revolution and the social question for people listening. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm talking about the end of the social question chapter on revolution. And then the second mode of solidarity, and she says the one that was more apparent in the United States than in France, was one in which you tried to imagine a solidarity based not on pity, but on everyone, including not only the poor, but also the rich, and not only the weak, but the powerful, and the black and the white, and everyone. And she says that's going to be a much more humble, much more, much less. It's gonna create a solidarity that is much more decentralized, federalized in her view, but one that allows trying to encompass everybody. And that's the idea, I think, of solidarity that she has in mind. That she never really does much with it. I admit. I mean, I'm extrapolating a few pages out.
Yeah.
But I think it's.
Yeah.
I think it's in line with a lot of things she writes elsewhere, although she never uses those specific terms, as far as I know, elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good place to end, and, thinking about solidarity and, active citizen participation in government, you might want to plug our fall conference. I'm just,
If we have a fall, I mean, I'm
throw
hoping
the baseball.
I'm hoping we have a conference. I'm hoping we have college again in the fall. I mean, I mean, who knows how long this is going to take? I mean, if we're not going to have a vaccine for another 7 or 8 months, or more,
Yeah.
I have no idea what happens in September, October. But assuming we're back to some sort of some semblance of a public, active, outside, non-socially distancing life. Every October, the Hannah Arendt Center has a major international conference at Bard College, and it's on a theme. This year, the theme is revitalizing democracy on sortition and citizen juries, and it's an idea that goes back to the Greeks. Most of the Athenian officials that were elected to run that were chosen to run their government were not elected, but were chosen by lottery. Most democracies, all the middle-aged democracies in Italy and others, used lottery and not election. And Aristotle, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and all the theorists who talked about it said that in aristocracies you use elections to pick your leaders, and in democracies you use lottery. We're not going to go back to picking all of our representatives by lottery. I'm not clueless. But there are a number of, I think, to me, the most interesting part of the activist left is one that's geared around creating citizen juries and citizen assemblies, where you bring people together by lottery, chosen from all around society, to talk about major issues, be it the environment or abortion or gay marriage or whatever it is. And you let them meet together for a few days or a few days a week or whatever over a couple months, and they can bring in experts, they can bring in people to inform them, they deliberate, they talk to each other, and they come up with ideas on how to solve or approach these problems. And these citizen assemblies and citizen juries have been incredibly successful where they've been tried. And they've been tried in the United States on private levels, but around the world now, in Canada, Ireland, Germany, and France, actually being convened by the governments of these countries in order to help break through with new ideas, the kind of new ideas that I was talking about, that come through, not through one side or the other winning, but bringing people together and trying to find some sort of a meaningful consensus of some sort. And so we're going to be bringing some of the leading thinkers around these citizen juries from all over the world together in October at the Arendt Center at Bard to talk about how to revive democracy in our time. So we'd love to see you there.
Something we desperately need right now. All right. Thank you, Roger, for taking the time to make this recording with me. And I look forward to seeing you in person when we don't have to
I hope so. Thank you very much, Sam. Enjoy your solitude.
Oh, I will. You too. Bye.
All right.